On September 3rd, 1260, in a valley called Ain Jalut in northern Palestine, the Mamluk Sultan Qutuz stood with roughly 20,000 soldiers and watched the army that had conquered half the known world ride toward him with the absolute certainty of victory. The Mongols had never lost a major battle in 40 years of continuous conquest. They had destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire, massacred millions in Persia, obliterated Baghdad, and slaughtered hundreds of thousands in Islam's holiest city, conquered Syria, and sent advance forces into Egypt. Everywhere the Mongols went, they left pyramids of skulls, burned libraries, and traumatized populations. Their military system was the most sophisticated in the world. Their composite bows outranged any enemy. Their cavalry tactics were unmatched. They were led by Kitbuqa, a Nestorian Christian general serving Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan himself. The Mongol force at Ain Jalut numbered perhaps 15,000 to 20,000, smaller than previous Mongol armies, but still terrifying because Mongols didn't lose. They had conquered from China to Eastern Europe. They had destroyed every army that faced them. The Islamic world was in complete panic, believing the Mongols were a punishment from God that could not be resisted. But Sultan Qutuz and his general Baibars were not ordinary Muslims, and their Mamluk soldiers were not ordinary warriors. They were slave soldiers, taken as boys, trained from childhood in the arts of war, converted to Islam, and forged into the finest professional military force in the medieval world. And on this day, they would do what no army had done in living memory. They would destroy a Mongol army in open battle, kill its general, and stop the Mongol expansion westward forever. To understand the absolute impossibility of what the Mamluks achieved at Ain Jalut, you must understand the terror the Mongols had created across Eurasia. Between 1219 and 1260, the Mongol Empire had conducted the most devastating military conquests in human history. Genghis Khan had begun by destroying the Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia after its sultan foolishly executed Mongol ambassadors. The Mongol response was systematic annihilation. Cities that resisted were completely destroyed, their populations massacred down to the last child. The city of Nishapur in Persia reportedly had 1.7 million people killed, with skulls arranged in pyramids as warnings. The city of Merv, one of the largest in the world, was destroyed so completely that it never recovered, its irrigation systems deliberately ruined to ensure it could never be rebuilt. Historians estimate that the Mongol conquest of Central Asia and Persia between 1219 and 1258 killed between 11 million and 40 million people, roughly 10 to 20% of the entire world's population at that time. This wasn't just military conquest. It was deliberate extermination designed to terrorize future enemies into surrendering without resistance. The strategy worked. Cities across Asia would open their gates and surrender immediately when they heard Mongols were approaching, because resistance meant total destruction. By 1258, the Mongol Empire stretched from Korea to Poland, from Siberia to the Persian Gulf, the largest contiguous land empire in history, and it was still expanding. In February 1258, the Mongols under Hulagu Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, committed what Muslims considered the ultimate atrocity. They destroyed Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate and the cultural and religious center of Islam for 500 years. Baghdad was one of the world's great cities, home to perhaps 1 million people, containing the House of Wisdom, with hundreds of thousands of books and manuscripts accumulated over centuries. When the Mongols besieged Baghdad, the Caliph al-Mustasim initially refused to surrender, believing God would protect the holy city. The Mongols breached the walls with siege engines and Chinese gunpowder weapons. What followed was systematic slaughter lasting a week. Contemporary Muslim chroniclers claim between 200,000 and 800,000 people were killed. Modern historians estimate 400,000 to 800,000 deaths, making it possibly the largest urban massacre in medieval history. The Mongols killed indiscriminately, scholars, women, children, elderly, anyone they could find. They destroyed mosques and burned the libraries. The Tigris River reportedly ran black with ink from thousands of books thrown into it, then ran red with blood. The House of Wisdom, which had preserved Greek, Persian, and Indian knowledge through the Dark Ages, was burned, and its irreplaceable manuscripts were lost forever. The Abbasid Caliph, the spiritual leader of Sunni Islam, was captured and executed, reportedly rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses, so Mongol superstitions about not spilling royal blood would be satisfied. The destruction of Baghdad traumatized the Islamic world because it proved that neither holiness nor history could protect against Mongol power. If Baghdad could fall, anywhere could fall. After Baghdad, Hulagu's armies swept through Syria, capturing Aleppo and Damascus in early 1260. Advanced Mongol forces raided into Palestine and approached Egypt. The Mongol Khan sent ambassadors to Cairo demanding the Mamluk Sultanate surrender immediately. The message was clear: submit or be destroyed like Baghdad. Most Islamic rulers had submitted. The Seljuk Turks of Anatolia were Mongol vassals. The Armenians had allied with the Mongols. Many Syrian Muslim leaders had collaborated rather than resist. But Egypt was different because of the Mamluks. The Mamluk system was unique in medieval warfare. Mamluks were slave soldiers, but not slaves in the sense of oppressed laborers. They were military slaves, boys purchased or captured from Turkish and Circassian peoples in Central Asia and the Caucasus, brought to Egypt as children and given the finest military training available. They learned archery, horsemanship, swordsmanship, and tactics from masters. They were converted to Islam and indoctrinated with absolute loyalty to their military order. When their training was complete, they were freed and became a professional warrior caste. The system created soldiers with incredible skill and unit cohesion because they had trained together since childhood and had no family loyalties except to each other and their commanders. Mamluk heavy cavalry were arguably the finest in the world, equal to Mongols in horsemanship and archery, but superior in close combat due to better armor and swords. In 1260, the Mamluk Sultan was Qutuz, himself a former slave who had risen through military talent. When Mongol ambassadors arrived demanding surrender, Qutuz made a decision that shocked his own court. He executed the ambassadors, an act that meant war to the death with the Mongols. His advisors thought he was insane. The Mongols had never been defeated. They outnumbered the Mamluks in total forces, but Qutuz understood something crucial. The Mongols were not invincible. They were just better than everyone they had faced so far. Mongol tactics relied on superior mobility, archery, and the feigned retreat tactic, where they would pretend to flee, draw enemies into pursuit, then turn and destroy them. But these tactics required disciplined enemies who would chase in disorder. Mamluks wouldn't. They were trained cavalry who understood feigned retreats and wouldn't break formation to pursue. Qutuz also knew that Hulagu had withdrawn most of his army back to Mongolia because of a succession crisis after the great Khan Möngke died. Only about 15,000 to 20,000 Mongols remained in Syria under General Kitbuqa. This was the smallest Mongol force in decades, and it was the best chance anyone would ever have to defeat them. Qutuz mobilized the Mamluk army and marched north into Palestine. His second-in-command was Baibars, a Mamluk general of extraordinary talent and ruthless ambition. Baibars would prove crucial to the victory, but his ambitions would also lead to tragedy. The two armies met at Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath, in the Jezreel Valley, on September 3, 1260. The Mamluks numbered roughly 20,000 cavalry, professional soldiers in lamellar armor carrying composite bows, lances, and curved swords. The Mongols numbered 15,000 to 20,000, also highly trained cavalry with composite bows and light armor favoring mobility. Both armies were entirely cavalry because this would be a mobile battle, not a siege. The terrain favored neither side particularly, though the valley had hills and woods where troops could be concealed. Qutuz and Baibars devised a tactical plan specifically designed to counter Mongol tactics. They would use the Mongol feigned retreat strategy against them. Baibars would lead a vanguard of Mamluk cavalry forward to engage the Mongols. When the Mongols counterattacked, Baibars would retreat, but not in disorder, in a controlled fighting withdrawal designed to draw the Mongols into the valley where Qutuz waited with the main Mamluk force hidden in the hills. It was a dangerous plan because if Baibars' retreat became a real rout, the battle would be lost. The battle began with Baibars leading several thousand Mamluk cavalry forward to engage Kitbuqa's Mongol vanguard. The Mongols, confident as always, charged immediately. The two cavalry forces collided in a swirl of arrows, lances and swords. Mamluk and Mongol archery was roughly equal in quality, with both sides shooting composite bows from horseback at full gallop. The initial clash was relatively even, which itself was remarkable because Mongols usually dominated the opening phase of cavalry battles. Then Baibars ordered the retreat. His Mamluks began pulling back, shooting arrows as they withdrew, with Mongols pursuing. This was the critical moment. If Baibars retreated too quickly, the Mongols might suspect a trap. If he retreated too slowly, his forces would be destroyed. Baibars managed the withdrawal perfectly, fighting just hard enough to make the Mongols believe they were winning, pulling back just fast enough to stay ahead of the pursuit, leading the Mongols deeper into the valley. Kitbuqa, the Mongol general, either didn't recognize the trap or didn't care, believing Mongol superiority would win regardless. He committed his main force to pursuing Baibars. The Mongols rode deeper into the valley, their formation becoming slightly disordered as faster cavalry pulled ahead of slower units in the pursuit. Then Qutuz sprang the trap. From the hills on both sides of the valley, thousands of Mamluk cavalry charged down onto the Mongol flanks. Qutuz himself led the charge, reportedly shouting, "Islam! Islam!" and striking the first blow. The Mongols were caught in the worst possible tactical situation. Compressed in a valley, being attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, unable to use their mobility advantage. Baibars immediately wheeled his vanguard around and charged back into the Mongols from the front, creating a three-sided attack. The Mongols tried to form defensive circles, a standard Mongol tactic when surrounded, but the terrain and numbers worked against them. The battle became a grinding cavalry melee, where individual combat skill and unit cohesion mattered more than tactical maneuvers. The Mamluks excelled at close combat. Their lamellar armor protected better than Mongol light armor. Their swords were superior to Mongol sabers. And critically, they fought with the discipline of professional soldiers who had trained together for years, while the Mongols, despite their reputation, were struggling in terrain and tactical circumstances they weren't prepared for. The battle lasted hours, with neither side breaking. Mongols had never retreated from a field battle before, and even surrounded, they fought with desperate courage. But the casualties mounted steadily against them. General Kitbuqa fought personally at the head of his troops, trying to rally the Mongols through leadership. But as the day wore on and Mamluk numbers continued to press, the Mongol formation finally broke. This was unprecedented. Mongols didn't break. They feigned retreats tactically, but they didn't flee in panic. But at Ain Jalut, surrounded and outnumbered, exhausted from hours of combat, the Mongol army finally collapsed. Warriors who had conquered half the world fled the battlefield in disorder. The Mamluks pursued, cutting down fleeing Mongols. Kitbuqa was captured during the rout. The Mamluks brought him before Sultan Qutuz. Even in captivity, Kitbuqa showed defiance. reportedly telling Qutuz that Mongol armies would return and avenge this defeat. Qutuz ordered him executed immediately. Kitbuqa was beheaded, his head sent to Cairo as a trophy. The Mongol army was destroyed. Perhaps half the 15,000 to 20,000 Mongols were killed in the battle or pursuit. The survivors fled back to Syria and then further east. The myth of Mongol invincibility was shattered. For the first time since Genghis Khan had begun conquests 40 years earlier, a Mongol army had been completely defeated in open battle. The strategic consequences of Ain Jalut were immediate and lasting. The Mongol advance into the Middle East stopped permanently. Hulagu Khan, upon hearing of the defeat, never again attempted to invade Egypt or Syria in force. The Ilkhanate he established in Persia would fight occasional border wars with the Mamluks, but never seriously threatened Egypt again. The Islamic world, which had been in complete panic since Baghdad's fall, suddenly had hope. Mamluks were celebrated as saviors of Islam. Sultan Qutuz was hailed as a hero. But his triumph lasted exactly 3 weeks. On the return journey to Cairo, his general Baibars and other Mamluk commanders assassinated him during a hunting trip. The sources vary on motive. Some claim Qutuz had promised Baibars the governorship of Aleppo and reneged. Others suggest Baibars simply wanted power. Regardless, Baibars murdered the man who had saved Islam from the Mongols and took the sultanate for himself. Baibars would rule as sultan for 17 years, expanding Mamluk territory, defeating crusaders, and establishing the Mamluk Sultanate as the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean. He was a brilliant general and ruthless politician, but he was also a murderer and usurper who killed his commander 3 weeks after their greatest victory. This ugly reality is often downplayed in Islamic histories that celebrate Ain Jalut, but it reveals the brutal nature of Mamluk politics, where military skill and political murder went hand in hand. The human cost of Ain Jalut was relatively light compared to earlier Mongol battles. Perhaps 7,000 to 10,000 soldiers died total, mostly Mongols. This seems small compared to the hundreds of thousands killed at Baghdad or other Mongol conquests. But the significance wasn't the death toll, it was the precedent. Ain Jalut proved Mongols could be beaten using professional cavalry tactics, terrain advantages, and superior close combat skill. It established the Mamluks as the premier military power in the region, a position they would hold for over 250 years until the Ottomans conquered Egypt in 1517. And it prevented the Mongols from conquering Africa and potentially Western Europe, because if Egypt had fallen, there would have been no significant power capable of stopping further Mongol expansion westward. Historians debate whether the Mongols would have continued west even if victorious at Ain Jalut, because political factors in Mongolia were pulling them eastward. But Ain Jalut removed the option permanently. The mythology around Ain Jalut in Islamic culture transformed it into a legendary victory, where righteous Muslim warriors defeated the pagan hordes. This narrative downplays several uncomfortable facts. First, General Kitbuqa and many of his troops were Nestorian Christians, making this partly a Christian-Muslim conflict, not just Mongol versus Muslim. Second, the Mamluks themselves were recent converts to Islam, slave soldiers whose loyalty was to their military caste more than to Islamic religious principles. Third, the victory was achieved through tactical deception, the feigned retreat, which is brilliant strategy but not the heroic stand often depicted. Fourth, the immediate aftermath involved Baibars murdering Qutuz, which complicates the narrative of Islamic unity and righteousness. And fifth, the Mamluks would go on to rule Egypt and Syria as a military dictatorship that extracted crushing taxes from peasants and merchants to fund their military campaigns. They saved the Islamic world from Mongols, but they weren't benevolent saviors. They were professional soldiers who fought for pay and power as much as for faith. The Mongol perspective on Ain Jalut is equally complex. From the Mongol viewpoint, the defeat was a tactical setback caused by limited numbers and overconfidence, not proof that Mongols were defeatable generally. The Mongols continued to dominate Central Asia and held the Ilkhanate in Persia for another 80 years. They would destroy other enemies and continue expanding eastward. Ain Jalut stopped westward expansion but didn't break Mongol power overall. Some Mongol sources blamed Kitbuqa for tactical errors, suggesting he should have waited for reinforcements or avoided battle in unfavorable terrain. Others blamed Hulagu for withdrawing most of the army back to Mongolia during a succession crisis, leaving too few troops in Syria. The reality is probably that Kitbuqa underestimated the Mamluks, believing the Mongol reputation alone would cause them to fight poorly, and was outmaneuvered by generals who understood Mongol tactics well enough to counter them. The broader historical impact of Ain Jalut was that it created a stable balance of power in the Middle East. The Mamluks controlled Egypt, Syria, and the Hejaz, including Mecca and Medina. The Mongol Ilkhanate controlled Persia and Iraq. Neither could conquer the other, creating a border that remained relatively stable for decades. This balance allowed both powers to focus elsewhere. The Mamluks attacked the remaining Crusader states, capturing Acre in 1291 and ending the Crusades, while the Mongols fought among themselves in succession wars and eventually converted to Islam themselves in the early 14th century. By 1300, the Mongol threat to the Islamic heartland was over, not because they had been militarily defeated everywhere, but because they had been stopped in the West and had integrated into the Eastern Islamic world as rulers rather than conquerors. The Battle of Ain Jalut remains one of history's most significant turning points, a moment when the seemingly unstoppable force met an immovable object and was, for the first time, stopped. The Mamluks didn't destroy the Mongol Empire, they couldn't, but they prevented its further expansion into the Islamic heartland and Africa. They proved that with superior tactics, professional training, and the courage to face an enemy everyone else fled from, even the Mongols could be beaten. On September 3rd, 1260, 20,000 Mamluk slave soldiers annihilated 15,000 Mongol cavalry and changed the course of world history, not through superior numbers or technology, but through tactical brilliance, professional discipline, and the willingness to fight when everyone else counseled surrender. It was one of medieval warfare's greatest upsets, and it ensured that the Middle East would remain Islamic rather than becoming part of the Mongol Empire, altering the religious, cultural, and political landscape of an entire region for the next 8 centuries.